Welcome to another HealthCast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you probably remember, if you've been watching any of the previous videos, that we did about 3 sessions on vaccinations, all the implications, and we followed that by, if you decide not to be vaccinated, what can you do? And we talked about some of the ideas that were necessary to make us healthy and to enhance our ability to stay healthy. And we talked about some factors, nutrition. We mentioned, we didn't go into detail too much about nutrition. And we talked about homeopathic medicine as a viable approach to deal with those things that might come along after we're well nutritioned. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about the nutritional side and how it reflects how well we deal with health and life and death, etc., etc. And so I'm referring to this video as Our Health Crisis, the Solution. Now, I'm sure you've all heard me say that I have done literally thousands of hours of research and going back for the last 200 years in terms of health, sickness, medicine, diet, soil, you name it, everything related to our life. So today we want to talk just a bit more about the real solution to our health issues. Now, I'm sure you know by now that our sick bill is no longer sustainable. If 20 to 25% of our gross national product is going just for medical care, then something is wrong. Very, very wrong. And we can't afford it. If you look back at how high the bill is getting, the increase in medical costs have far exceeded all the other increases in all other industries, and it's continuing to rise. And why? Because we're sicker than ever with more serious problems than ever, and hence it costs a lot more. The procedures have gotten expensive, the treatments have gotten expensive, and as an outcome of all of that, where are we? Well, we're certainly not healthier. I don't think anyone who's paid any attention at all would say that we've become a well nation. In fact, we don't even rank very high in the world in terms of our health and medical care. We have more problems than many of the even undeveloped countries. And as I've gone back and looked through some of those numbers put together by the World Health Organization, we don't do so well when compared to a lot of other countries in the world. And of course, when you look at it, on top of it, we consume 50% of all the drugs, and we're only a fraction of the world population, so something isn't working, as we can well see. Now, there's more people who are sick with more degenerative diseases, more dying of organs in the body, having to be replaced, and yet we continue to raise the bill, and we continue to make more promises, as let's say at least the medical establishment in general does, and we're always sitting there with our tongue hanging out waiting for that miracle drug that's going to come along, that's going to take care of our problem, and of course it never does. I'm not saying that we don't manage the symptoms so that it's less uncomfortable to live, but we certainly are not healthier, and it's only a matter of time, and we live in dread for that next problem to come along, and that hope that another drug will come along that will enable us to cope with the problem. Now, notice that I didn't say cure the problem. And I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, and I'll mention again, and I'll mention again until it begins to stick. Something isn't right, something is amiss. And what we want to do is to discuss some of those issues and give you a few references of some things you can look at to see what the problem is. Now, it doesn't take much to look at the history in this country of our health, and Great Britain and France and most of the European countries, to see that we haven't gotten healthier, and that they're all in the same boat to a degree. Now, we have been the leader in going downhill, I would say, and the others, however, as they've adopted the American way, have gone down more than they were before instead of up. Now, I studied in Germany on many occasions, England, Austria, and many other countries, and I remember when I first went to Germany and was learning something about some of the new methodologies that they have developed, and I say new, the way of utilizing is new, but homeopathic medicine, which has been big in a lot of areas, but is actively attempting to be discounted to the point that people would not spend their money on it, the natural approach, and have they, in spite of it, have gone down because they have started changing diets, eating and consuming a lot of the same junk that Americans do, and consequently, when I was laughed at, and some of us that went over to Germany and Austria and so forth to study, we had a group, and there still is a group. I haven't been there for a while, but I went on 7 different study tours, and the people there were, the doctors were laughing because in discussing various issues, the subject of vitamins or food supplements was brought up. And the German doctors were laughing, well, you Americans and your vitamins, which is what they call vitamins, your vitamins, you don't need all that stuff. You just have to give the body a little assist and help it to detox out some of the issues that's picked up, and everything will be fine. And I remember Dr. Helmut Schimmel, who came over to this country and did many, many programs, and on many of the German programs when I was there, we had sessions with Dr. Schimmel. He was a very forward doctor, very interested and sincere in helping people live healthy, and he thought it was funny that we over here, the doctors wanted to use vitamins and supplements of various sorts, and I noticed on my last trip there that all of a sudden in their big conference they have once a year called the International Biological Medicine Week, where people from all over the world who are interested in alternatives to health came, and all of a sudden there were tables in the exhibition hall of companies, including some American companies, with vitamins, and there were all these pamphlets talking about the utilization of vitamins in therapy. So what had happened is that over the years, as they continued to adapt more of our food types, and more fast food restaurants developed over there, that the people started going downhill. And what they noted, that the way they used to treat people wasn't working as well. In fact, Dr. Schimmel would come over here occasionally and do a program, and the doctors would bring in people or themselves that had health problems that they were unable to resolve, and want Dr. Schimmel to check the person and put together a program. Well, he would do it in the manner in which they did it in Germany, but what happened was they were finding the people weren't responding. And so finally, after several sessions with Dr. Schimmel, one day he said, if you American doctors can get people well, you're a pretty good doctor, because they weren't responding well to his treatment that was working in Germany. But now, as time has moved on, and we see more of the fast food restaurants popping up in all these countries, big problems are developing there. And so now those doctors are being forced to expand their approach to getting people well. Now, of course, I know that supplements don't really ultimately solve the problem. They will temporarily give you a boost, but to really gain health, you're going to need to do some of the things that we're going to be talking about. People are getting sicker younger in this country, and I guess it's starting there too, and with more serious problems. We have an obesity problem in very young children now that we never had before. When I think back when I was young growing up and going to school, we had maybe one or two people that I knew of that had some excessive weight. Everyone else was on the thin side. I know I was always thin when I was young, and no matter how much I ate, I didn't put on any weight. And so I thought of myself as being skinny, and I even took some muscle development programs, and ultimately I got stronger, but I did not get bigger. And of course, later when I learned a lot about food and blood type and so forth, I realized that some people are predisposed to not building a large muscular frame, and some are. Some can do it very easily, and some with very little effort can have a more robust looking body. But it didn't work for me. I did get very strong and could even arm wrestle some of the guys with muscles almost twice my size, because even though they were bigger, they weren't necessarily stronger. And it was interesting. I had a friend who kept bugging me. He had been doing weight training and had a large frame to begin with. And as he worked out, he increased his size of his muscles. The muscle mass was larger. And so he always kept after me about wanting to arm wrestle. And of course, I had thin arms and I didn't have big muscles. And he was sure he could just lay my hand down like that. Well, anyhow, one day in a class in front of a lot of the other students, he kept challenging and provoking me, and finally I said, okay. And so we did. We arm wrestled in the classroom because the teacher hadn't gotten there yet. And I remember that he tried until he was perspiring, and he could not put my arm down. Now, I couldn't put his down, but neither of us could put the other down. But he was absolutely sure and very shocked when he found out that I was not a pushover as much as he thought. As I said, my muscles got stronger, but they didn't get big. And so he thought he had a walkthrough, but it wasn't. It's not just mass, of course. There's a lot of factors involved. And we're not going to get into weight building and muscle strength and all that, but just to say that some people, they're just not going to put on big muscles, and I would happen to be one of those people. If you're blood type O and you're gonadal dominant, which you can be, then you can very easily build up muscle. There's other factors that come along with it, but generally speaking, it's easy for them. They don't have to work at it much at all, and by nature they tend to look larger and more muscular. So at any rate, we have all this people who are getting sicker, and the young children with type 2 diabetes at 6 to 8 years old, almost an epidemic, which was always considered a very old person problem, if at all. Also, we have kids having their gallbladders out at 13 and 14, heart attacks in the teens, strokes in the 20s. That does not give us a good outcome for all of these billions and now trillions of dollars that are going for health care, and people are sick a lot. Many people are on ongoing drugs. It's not just that they are taking a few drugs, it's ongoing. And so I guess the biggest, I made comments before about it won't be long till people will be on 15, 20, 25 drugs. And I had a new patient come into my office, and the lady was on 25 different medications. Now, I know when I studied pharmacology that even 2 drugs or 3, already there's about an 18% chance, plus or minus, that you have adverse interaction with those drugs, and there's no way that they can test all the drugs in all combinations to know when it could happen. And that is saying nothing of the individual. Every individual is different. And we've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, Dr. Roger Williams, a PhD researcher in nutrition and health, many years ago wrote a book called Biochemical Individuality, in which he talked about the fact that everyone is different. Some people need more certain vitamin factors than others. All these genetic differences that we come in with, and now epigenetic, as you're probably beginning to hear, I've mentioned it. It's still not big yet on the news or in the public eye, but more and more books and doctors are becoming aware of it. Many of the newer books that I'm getting now are about it. In fact, there's one called The Genie and the Genes that is all about research in epigenetics. And epigenetics means the things that you either brought in with you or that you have acquired according to your lifestyle that predispose you to certain types of things, both physical and behavioral wise. And so it's interesting to me, of course, that many years ago, Dr. Samuel Hahnemann in Germany did a big study and ultimately published about miasmic disturbances that we bring in with us that predispose, and that was before everything was known about genetics, in fact, hardly anything. People did know that certain traits could be inherited, eye color, hair color, skin texture and color, etc., but they didn't know a whole lot about it, and of course, epigenetic was, as I say, not even in existence in terms of a term for it or even understanding. So he named those predispositions that we bring in miasms, which means an inherited taint. So he, even though he didn't have all the tools and all the research back in the early 1800s up through later 1800s that we have today, he became aware that this can be a problem, and I learned how to address it back then. Now the problem is worse because there are other complicating factors. Bottom line is, we're calling this the health crisis, the solution, and of course it is not a single solution as usual. Very few things are. It's usually a lot more complex. And the big problem in my mind, well, I'll tell you some of the other things, but one of the things in itself that's become a big problem is the treatment of acute illnesses by drug suppression. When you suppress a person's illness, it goes deeper and becomes a chronic health problem, and ultimately the people can move into a very serious state. And at each stage in this digression, more drugs are supplied to try to manage more symptoms, and ultimately the person is very sick. And the doctors don't realize, it's not taught in the medical schools, they don't realize, when I say the doctors of traditional medicine in this country, which sometimes is referred to as allopathic medicine, which really means to give you something that creates a disease opposite to the one you have so that it suppresses the symptoms. And Hahnemann learned way back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that the suppression leads to a deeper serious problem. The Chinese before that I mentioned that last time. They talk about the fact that if a disturbance in the body is beginning and you don't take care of it, it goes deeper and becomes a more serious problem over time. And so when you suppress any kind of acute illnesses, ultimately you now bring on chronic. And then you at some point bring on disturbances of the cell's function, and then they begin to malfunction and degenerate more, and you go from an itis to an osis, and ultimately the penetration to the core of a cell, to the DNA, and now you have a neoplastic or a dedifferentiation problem, which means a tumor or cancer. And so the suppressions ultimately lead to that. And so you get all these degenerative issues developing because of all of the suppression. But see, that's only part of the problem. When you really get into it deep, the core thing that I've mentioned many times already, and of course I kind of have to bring it in because you need to see it all in perspective. And if you look back over the or listen back to some of the old broadcasts, as you get the one that I've mentioned many times, homotoxicology, you'll see how this all plays out, very neatly arranged in a graphic style by Dr. Hans-Heinrich Reckeweg from Germany, when he realized what was happening when you were suppressing. And so if you look back, you'll see that I've talked about different pieces of what I'm talking about today, but I wanted to bring it together in an organized way so that you could get a better idea of how this is playing out, and that there are people aware of it, there's doctors aware of it. But unfortunately, you don't hear about it because the books that they write and the research papers that come out don't get the evening news. No one talks about it, and many of the things that are being found out, you're not going to hear about because they run counter to the interest of the large pharmaceuticals that are pumping out drugs to manage symptoms. If you read or listen to what they say, you're going to notice they're not talking about curing anything. They're talking about managing symptoms. If you've got a headache, you take a pill that manages the headache. They don't care why you have the headache, and in most cases they don't know, but they know you're going to feel better if you take this drug that turns off that pain sensation, and it has to people feel better. And if they feel better, they think they are better, because no matter how I go about it and no matter how people talk about it, people are inclined to think no symptom, no problem. And that's not true. Even the World Health Organization and their definition of health recognizes that it is more than just the absence of symptoms. And so it is true, you can come out with drugs that will suppress all kinds of symptoms, pains, aches, fevers, you name it, inflammations. There's all kinds of drugs that will manage that. But if you get back again from homotoxicology, and you're going to know or realize that these symptoms, in most cases, are just the immune system bringing on a response to get rid of something that should not be in your body. So you've taken on some type of toxin, whether it be chemical, whether it be pesticide, chemical solvents, you name it, organic chemicals of all kinds, or whether it be a virus, which is the cellular toxin, or whether it be toxic metals, whatever it is that you get. And I was just reading recently, and when I say recently, very recently, that just breathing alone brings into your system 1 microgram of mercury per day. Now, if the body is working properly, it has systems that are able to sequester that metal and dispose of it out of the body. But that means only if the body is working right. If the body isn't working right, then we are going to accumulate. I have people come in, and when we've done testing and said, well, it appears that you have a significant amount of mercury or lead or arsenic, beryllium, antimony, nickel, you name it, of various types. Now uranium has been showing up significantly, and I'm not even going to get into the issues about uranium, but it's there. Thorium, which is a radioactive substance, also. Those things are coming in more and more. And so if the body is unable to cope with it, it ends up being deposited in the body. And as it deposits in the body, it interferes with functions in the body. And hence, we've got a problem. Now, as I say, a well-functioning body that's well-nutritioned has the ability to sequester and to dispose of those metals so that the likelihood of building a toxic load is not there. Now, I know that the amalgam fillings, which of course the dental profession still denies in most cases, not to say all dentists do, but the profession as a whole still denies that there's any relationship between amalgam fillings, which have a high percentage of mercury, that's a problem. And yet I've had dentists come in as patients, and when they would sit, their hands would have a tremor, and they've in many cases even had to quit practicing dentistry because they couldn't drill very well or work very well in the mouth with their hand shaking. And tremor, of course, neurological tremor is one of the symptoms of mercury poisoning. And or paralysis or loss of strength of muscle can be lead poisoning. And but not just the physical body, but the mental functions. The brain is affected, and hence the mental function by some of these metals. And so as we look around and see what all the things are going on, and as I was able to uncover by going back, and as I say for the last 200 years, nutrition is at the core. If you are not properly nutritioned, you've got a big problem. Why is nutrition so important? Because all the bodily functions require certain nutrients and elements to function properly. And some of the structures require. In other words, for example, fatty acids. If you don't have the right fatty acids in the body, you can't build high-quality cell walls. And if you can't build high-quality cell walls, then the cell doesn't function properly. It doesn't take in what it's supposed to and discharge what it's supposed to and set up a barrier so that certain things can't get in. And it cannot maintain a proper electrical charge. And there's many, many studies that show that when the membrane potential drops on the cell wall, the cell begins to weaken in its function, it begins to lose its ability to detox, and it starts to become a sick cell, getting back to homotoxicology. And as if it gets sick enough, then you're in big trouble. Then you're going to organ failure and so forth. And so, not a good picture. And so, well, can't we just go out and eat food? I mean, what difference does it make? I heard a doctor interviewed, it's been a few years now, but it was on national news out of the one of the major medical schools in the state of Florida. And he said if you ate a McDonald's hamburger and French fries and milkshake, that you had a good balanced meal. And now I haven't heard that recently, but that's kind of the attitude because diet is not stressed in medical training. What they're told is that if you just eat food, you're going to somehow get out of that food all the things you need, and that sickness has nothing to do with that. Yet at the same time, if you'll remember that way back in history of the last 200 years again, they found out the deficiency of certain vital amines or vitamins, the term came from the phrase vital amines. There are certain nutrient vitamins that are very important for the body to work right, and when they're deficient, the body begins to develop a pattern or a picture of symptoms. And those were deficiency symptoms. And when they supplied those vitamins by mouth, just isolated vitamins, they were able to get rid of it, or if they supplied food that was high in those vitamins. And there was a time when the food did have all the vitamins, did have all the minerals. And in my mind, of course, the biggest thing are the minerals. The minerals are extremely important because they are the cofactors that work with enzymes to make things work. They become part of the structure of the body, i.e. the bone and connective tissue and so forth. So all these things are necessary to make it work right. And if we don't have them, we've got a big problem. And all one has to do is to go to the Department of Agriculture and check on the nutrient density of food over the last, well, different times they do studies. But way back in the 20s and 30s, it was known that the food was already beginning to become mineral deficient. And I mentioned the paper that was wrote about it, the Modern Miracle Men, that became a U.S. Senate document, which of course you can't get now, at least not from the government printing office. And they were talking about the fact that when people were supplied with food that was properly mineralized, that they got healthy or stayed healthy. If they were sick, the symptoms they were expressing were deficiency symptoms. Now, at the same time as this was being discovered, the pharmaceutical interests were growing, and of course they weren't concerned as to, again, why you had the problem. All they wanted to do was give you a medication that would in some way manage your symptoms so you would feel better. And so we have a lot of people today functioning, and they say they're great, but of course they may be taking 2, 3, 4, 5 medications, pharmaceutical drugs, so their symptoms are kept in check, but they aren't well. It's a facade to think that just because you're symptom-free, as the World Health Organization said, does not mean you're really healthy. To be healthy, you mean you have high energy, your immune system is functioning well, that it doesn't mean you'll never get sick, but it means if you do pick up something toxic, your body responds to it, and depending on what it is, it could be an inflammation as the response, or it could just bind up something and dispose of it, which is one of the things it could do. Again, this is all presuming that it works right. And so it's a big issue as to whether we have nutrients. Now, some of the newer things that are coming out now related to nutrients are, and we'll mention a little bit about it, is a new book, pretty new, called Deep Nutrition. It's a pretty book, too. Deep Nutrition, Why Your Genes Need Traditional Food. Now, this is written by an MD, and it's an interesting book because she has some very good information about what's going on and about her functioning as a doctor. Now, I've mentioned before about some of the doctors, the comments that they're beginning to make now. When I'm using that term doctor, I'm talking about MDs and, of course, DOs. There was a time when there was a different philosophy for DOs. They started from the structure first and nutrition and all of those factors, and only later did they realize that the medical doctors were spending less time with the patient, writing prescriptions, and they were making more money, and so the profession as a whole made a shift. And so today it's really difficult to tell what background degree-wise one has, whether it's a DO, a doctor of osteopathy, which has to do with bone and structure, or whether they're a doctor of medicine, an MD. There's no difference unless you happen to see the letters, because what happened is that the DOs in general, not all, because some of them refuse to give up the holistic idea that the body is an integral unit and you have to deal with the whole body and that it requires nutrition and so forth. But a lot of them did. They became regular doctors, and they abandoned what the philosophy was of osteopathy. Dr. Still was the name of the doctor who at one time said that, if your structure is out of balance, the organs become displaced, and displaced organs don't function properly. And so the structural thing became an important issue, and so he started a whole new school of medicine, and they developed their own colleges, and they taught the doctor of osteopathic approach, and many of them did that for quite some time until the transition occurred. And as I say, unfortunately, it made a change, but now I'm noticing a change within the ranks. Some are starting to look back. They're beginning to realize that they're not getting people well, and they're going back and looking at some of the ideas that Dr. Still and some of the early pioneers in the field of medicine, which I call the true healing arts doctors, were able to get people well and keep them well without giving them a pile of prescriptions to take to try to give them the false feeling that they're okay because their symptoms are being managed. And so, anyhow, in this book called Deep Nutrition, Why Your Genes Need Traditional Food, the author's name is Catherine Shanahan, MD, and it is a very good book, actually. And she's talking about some of the newest material that's coming out, and how actually the expression of our genes is also dictated by our nutrition. In a sense, here's what she says on page 26. In a sense, our lifestyles teach our genes how to behave. In choosing between healthy or unhealthy foods and habits, we are programming our genes for either good or bad conduct. Scientists are identifying numerous techniques by which two sets of identical DNA can be coerced into functioning dissimilarly. And what they did is they even studied identical twins, that when they were real young, the genetic structure and function was very similar, almost identical. But by the time they did studies on 50-year-old twins, they found that one of those twins had deviated tremendously from the other based on the lifestyle that they'd carried out over the years. And so it's very important, even for proper genetic expression, to have a body that is well nutritioned. That's my term, nutritioned, but it's true. Now, I'm going to read another part of this just because it emphasizes where I see that the medical profession has moved to compared to what they were when I was young. When I was young, doctors hardly made more than most of the people they treated, and they worked 7 days a week and were on call 24 hours a day. They went out to the house. I remember when I was young, occasionally something would come up, and actually I'm trying to think of one occasion, I think, that the doctor actually came to our house for me, and I think for my mother they came once. But they would come if needed. And so here's what she has to say in the epilogue of her book. After telling this whole story, and we're not going to take the time to go through all this material, but that she talks about, but I think you get the picture of what she's saying in terms of the need of proper nutrition. She calls it traditional food, even for your genetics and epigenetics. She does get into epigenetics in the book, and if you're not clear on epigenetics, if you get the book by Dawson Church, PhD researcher, called The Genie and the Genes, the second edition, unless there's a third now, but the second edition would be the latest that I'm aware of, you can get some ideas about the research that's being done with epigenetics. Now, as I say, it's starting to pop up in several books. It popped up in this one, which is a relatively new book. It was only published just in recent years. Let's see if I can find it real fast. 2009. Okay, here's what she says in the epilogue. Health without health care. Now, she mentions another book, which we're going to be talking about that subject again in more detail than we have in time past. A lot of these things we kind of bring up in passing and something we're talking about, but at some point we go into it much more in depth. And it's just like today, we're not going to tell you about a lot of specific approaches to nutrition, but we're going to tell you about the importance of nutrition and of high-density nutrient foods and non-GMO, because we're going to talk about the GMO just a little. But anyhow, she quotes from a book by Roy Moynihan and Alan Cassels called Selling Sickness. And they say there's a lot of money to be made telling healthy people they're sick. The prologue to their book, published in 2005, paraphrases a candid interview of Merck's now retired chief executive Henry Gadsden, originally published in Fortune more than 30 years ago. Now, say there's nothing new. It goes back 30 years from that date, which was time that he was interviewed. Here's what Henry Gadsden had to say, suggesting he'd rather Merck be more like chewing gum maker Wrigley's. Gadsden, and the reason he said that, would be in everyone's home. And he said it had been a long dream of his to make drugs for healthy people, because then Merck would be able to sell to everyone. Now, that's been a plan for some time. It's not something new. And here's what she has to say about her own personal experience. She said, "While I was building my practice, my boss explained to me that to be successful, I would need more chronic patients in my panel. He explained that putting people on blood pressure and other medications, which would need periodic monitoring, was key to building a practice. I understood that from his perspective, keeping my patients healthy and medication-free was bad for business. The entrepreneurial mentality is endemic in today's healthcare model." Now, then she goes a little bit further. She said, "But these days, it's gone beyond populating one's own practice with as many unhealthy people as possible and doing little to improve their health. As I discovered in 2007, now the name of the game is to push as many drugs as you can by whatever means you get away with." When interviewed with the chief of family medicine at a large medical corporation on the West Coast, he explains that since he was part of a team of people who arranged for pharmaceutical companies to issue cash grants, he was in a position to offer me a particularly enticing salary. "What are the grants for?" I ask. "We have a quality improvement program that tracks physicians' prescribing patterns. We call it quality, but it's really about money." Now, I don't know if you heard that or not. I've mentioned it before. Now the pharmaceuticals, via the computers, can track the pharmacies and determine how much prescription writing the doctors are doing. Now, I personally know of one psychiatrist who quit medicine because he said, "I will not use the medications that are put out, that they don't get people well and they're too dangerous. And so if that's the story, that I'll lose my license if I don't write the prescriptions, then I guess I'm done." And he quit. He retired from medicine because he said, "I'm not giving people something that I don't believe is beneficial to help them." And so here she's told that they have this quality improvement program where they track physician prescribing patterns. Okay, now I know that the three people that I knew about, three different doctors, were contacted by the Board of Medicine, that the pharmaceutical companies had contacted them and said, "This doctor is not writing very many prescriptions." And so the medical board told the doctor, "If you're not going to be writing prescriptions, then you don't need a medical license. And in essence, you're going to lose your license if you don't write more prescriptions." So they are forced into it. I know of one doctor who actually took a job where they're evaluating claims for disability, so they don't have to write the prescriptions because they don't believe that they're necessary, and they were threatened with their license if they didn't write prescriptions. So then here's what else she has to say. Doctors who prescribe the most get big bonuses. Those who prescribe the least get fired. With a hint of incredulousness in his voice, he explained, so far, every time we've asked for funding for our program, the drug companies give it to us. And so she says, what I see is a massive campaign of nutrition-related disinformation that has reordered our relationship with food and reprogrammed our physiologies. Industry has moved past solving sickness and learned how to create it. Now, this is an MD saying that. And she says, whether by intent or simply fortuitous coincidence, today's definition of a healthy diet enables corporations to sell us cheap, easily stored foods that will put more money in their pockets and more people in the hospital. By denying our bodies the foods of our ancestors and severing ourselves from our culinary traditions, we are changing our genes for the worse. Now again, I'm not saying it, she's saying it. Just as corporations have rewritten the genetic code of fruits and vegetables to better suit their needs, they are now, in effect, doing the same thing to us. But there's one thing they've overlooked. Fruits and vegetables can't fight back, but we can. I think this was a very astute doctor who has come to the realization if she's ever going to get people well, she has to have them do healthy things and to stay away from the prescriptions. I'm not sure how long she'll be doing that because, as I say, I think that it's going to get worse, that as the alternative health cuts into the business of the pharmaceuticals, they are going to become worse in terms of their attempts to neutralize by bad publicity anything to do with alternative medicine. And they've done that already. I don't know if you've noticed that. And the only time that they will endorse it is if somehow they can monetize it and make a lot of money off of it and it's patentable. Yeah, they'll probably do it. Like vitamins, it became evident to the pharmaceuticals after years of telling people they were throwing their money away. I remember hearing all that. You're making expensive urine. The vitamins are worthless. You don't need it. All you have to do is eat your food. And of course the food, as I'm talking about, is not such good food. And so in the meantime, now she mentions about the altered food, what is being done to make it convenient for the people who are altering the food, genetically altering it, and that's what GMO is. If you haven't heard, GMO means genetically manipulated organisms. In other words, they've gone into the genes and they're altering them so that the plant grows a pesticide within the plant, so you won't have to, the food growers won't have to spend the money on the pesticides. But on the other side of it is that when we eat the food, we're getting the pesticide in our body. Now, this is becoming a hot subject, but in this country, of course, we don't have to worry because we have the FDA to protect us and watch out for us, right? Well, interestingly, the FDA position is that we're going to assume that GMO foods are safe, hence we're not going to require any testing, and we're not going to require the companies that are putting out genetically modified food, which is what the M means in the GMO, genetically modified. We're not going to require them to put that on the label. Now, some people are starting to put on the label that it's not GMO because they are aware that there is a growing concern about it. But there is a book out. In fact, there's another new one, but I'm not going to mention that at this time yet. I haven't read it. But this one is called Seeds of Deception. I would suggest you get it. It's very well done. It's called Exposing Industry and Government Lies About the Safety of Genetically Engineered Foods You're Eating. And it's a pretty dismal story. If you read this book, you're going to find out how much corruption, unfortunately, there is in the research industry, in as much as most of the research is being driven by money, and the money is being provided by the people who have a financial interest in the outcome, and hence, in many cases, and it's brought up in this book, people are told that, okay, we're going to give you this research money to research the safety of GMO, but we're going to reserve the right to take your research findings and alter and or delete them when we actually have them published. They also are telling them, if you're not going to be willing to be adaptable when you do the research, then we're not going to provide you with the grant for you to do the research. And here's a quote out of this book, which I thought is interesting. It says, in spite of the small body of research, GM foods are a regular part of the U.S. diet. Approximately 80% of the soy and 38% of the corn planted in the U.S. in 2003 is genetically engineered derivatives from these two crops, found in about 70% of processed foods. Okay, the regulations in the U.S. are so lax that there are no required pre-market safety tests. Now, here's an interesting thing that came out that he quotes, and yet you never hear this, and I'm surprised of the source of it because it's from the Center for Disease Control. Now, in March 2001, there was an article in the New York Times, and it was about the CDC's comments. And here's what it said. The CDC, Center for Disease Control, now says that food is responsible for twice the number of illnesses in the United States as scientists thought just 7 years ago. Okay, so 7 years before 2001, they thought illnesses related to diet and food are very minimal. But there are some. I mean, they were willing to grant that there could be some. At least 80% of food-related illnesses are caused by viruses or other pathogens that scientists cannot even identify. The reported cases include 5,000 deaths, 325,000 hospitalizations, and 70 million illnesses per year. This increase roughly corresponds to the period when Americans have been eating genetically modified food. In addition, obesity has skyrocketed. In 1990, no state had 15% or more of its population in the obese category. That's 1990. By 2001, only one state didn't. Diabetes rose by 33% from 1990 to 1998. Lymphatic cancers are up, and many other illnesses are on the rise. Is there a connection to GM foods? We have no way of knowing because no one has looked for one. Now, anyhow, he talks about some of the attempts to get information out to the public about how the laboratory animals responded. Especially some of them dropped dead pretty fast, and in some cases a whole group of them within a year died with using GMO foods. So Seeds of Deception by Jeffrey M. Smith is a very good book you may want to look at if you are really interested in health. Now, not only, of course, are we talking about nutritional deficiencies in the actual food itself, and we have talked about ways to take care of or find out something about the quality of the food. Now, testing for the GMO is very difficult. You have to have the right equipment to do it, but for whether there's quality in it, you can do that yourself. And one of my patients suggested that I put together whatever I could that people could do on their own to kind of pre-test food to see how healthy it is, meaning how much nutrients are present. And of course, as I say, some of the key players are the minerals because they're so important in the body to synthesize or to break down things. In other words, an enzyme can break things apart, such as indigestion, but there are cofactors that go with that to make the enzyme work properly, and those are the elements, things like magnesium and copper and zinc and some of the key elements that must be present if the enzyme is going to do its job. And of course there are enzymes that build things, put things together, which in the body is very important because the body has to break down and has to rebuild all kinds of things in the body. And so the chemical factory that's going on in that body is a tremendous job, and it entails a lot. I've mentioned before that there's different estimates, but one I read was that in any given second in every single cell in your body, there's about 100,000 different things going on biochemically inside that cell. Now, it takes a lot of different factors being present to make those things happen. And many times, if one key thing is missing, the process doesn't happen. Now, the deception of that is that sometimes the body is forced to work around and bypass and shut down something, which at that point you may not notice that it's happened. But down the road, once that's shut down, then other things begin to be influenced, and it's a chain reaction. And it's one of the big things about chronic illnesses and about malnutrition and all that. Outside of gross malnutrition, it doesn't show up immediately. It takes time for it to happen. And the problem is that you don't notice the causal connection. Chronic illnesses, I mentioned before, a study was done by a researcher within the regular medical field, and they took thousands of patient files and they studied the whole history of them. And their conclusion was that chronic illnesses have their beginnings 20 to 30 years previous. So your body can continue to function for a while without the proper nutrients, but at some point certain things start to shut down. Sometimes they're not so critical that you're going to die immediately, but there are times that could happen. If you get a dose of cyanide that shuts down the respiratory chain, that means that all of the mitochondria cannot make any energy at all, so it doesn't take long for the body to shut down. The big thing it can't utilize is oxygen, and hence you don't last very long without oxygen because you can't make any energy at all throughout the body. And so it only sometimes can take one toxin to have a major impact, and the results come on pretty fast, in this case in minutes. But they're not all like that. Some of them partially shut down certain functions, and hence it doesn't work as well. And so you may not notice it right away, but down the road, bit by bit, other things start to be affected until finally there's a major issue. But it didn't have its beginning then. It had its beginning back someplace else. Going back to what I said earlier, in many cases, medicine doesn't know the cause, and if they're not acquainted heavily with biochemistry and nutritional chemistry, they would never guess even what the cause was. All they know is it happens. We can't do anything about you having it, but what we can do is we can give you something that will kind of mask and cover over so you'll feel a little better in the process, while interior-wise your body is going downhill. Until finally one day it gets to the core of your cell, and then some bad things start to happen. So then all of a sudden we have a chronic problem. Now I have to put inside of these requirements to solve the problem of health, the $2.7 trillion health bill, is that not only are there nutritional deficiencies, but there are also emotional, mental issues. The stress that we're exposed to and how we deal with that stress, and some of our other problems that develop, many of them can be nutritionally caused, but many times they also interfere with the body's function. And that's when you get things like Consciousness and Healing, which is a relatively new book. It's not a single author. It's actually not an edited version, but a compiled version by Marilyn Schlitz and Tim Amrock with Mark S. McCausey. It's called an integral, this is a subtitle, Integral Approach to Mind-Body Medicine, but it's called Consciousness and Healing. And so what's happened is that many of the doctors have begun to realize that we have to also deal with these emotional things, because emotions can be just as toxic as toxins can in the body, and they can interfere with function, especially immune function. And so the whole thing of psychosomatics, or mind-body connection, is dealt with by all these different articles written by all these different doctors and researchers. And I think you'll find it worthwhile to kind of get a good overview of that. Now, there's another book called Nutrient Power, Heal Your Body Biochemistry and Heal Your Brain, who talks about even behaviors and sometimes what we call mental illnesses have a big nutritional or biochemic source, but the biochemistry, of course, ultimately is controlled by our nutrients. And if we don't have the nutrients, then we got a problem. Now, this book also goes a good bit into the epigenetic and the fact that we can inherit it from our lineage, as well as we can cause things to happen from our current lifestyle. In other words, if you want to look into that in more detail, there's a good book by Bruce Lipton. I think I've mentioned it before, and it's called The Biology of Belief, and he shows how cell function is affected by environment. And environment, he says, is two things: our biochemistry, meaning what we've taken in, the nutrients and so forth that we have, and the toxins we've accumulated. But he said it also involves our mental state, our emotional state. And so anyhow, this doctor's talking about sometimes the genes aren't working right, but if we look at the other book, Deep Nutrition, if you're nutritionally compromised, they can't function right. And so he's saying you have to have this chemistry right, and of course, I'm of the opinion that so many of these problems we're having today, these sudden going crazy and shooting a lot of people, is because of the psychiatric drugs. Now, he mentions in this book about the issue with drugs, and as I say, it's a good one. And I'll just read in the foreword a little bit here so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. And see, even the psychiatrist, Peter Bregan, who's a graduate of Harvard, taught at Harvard, been in psychiatry for years, wrote a very good book called Toxic Psychiatry. And he's against use of psychiatric drugs in treating people, doesn't solve their problem, and the psychiatric drugs bring on new problems. Now, listening to this psychiatrist, he says, psychiatry has made great advances in the past 50 years, but needs a new direction. Today's emphasis on prescription psychiatric medications will not stand the test of time. The drugs have helped millions of people diagnosed with depression and other mental disorders, but benefits usually are partial in nature and involve unpleasant side effects. Medication therapy is more art than science, and it involves a considerable amount of trial and error. In other words, it's not even a science. It's, here, let's try this and see what happens. A fundamental limitation is that psychiatric drugs are foreign molecules that result in an abnormal condition rather than producing normalcy. It's not going to make you better, but it may manage your symptom temporarily, at least to some degree, and sometimes it's hard to tell, because I know anymore the placebo effect is at least almost 40%, and now some researchers are saying that it's become as high as 70%. So many times if you get a drug and the doctor says, oh, this is the newest thing, this will really help you, it's going to help the person whether it really helps the person or not. It is unlikely that psychiatric drugs will ever be universally effective or free of adverse side effects. A new approach is needed. Recent programs in brain science has identified that molecular biology of many mental diseases, and this research provides a roadmap for developing effective drug-free treatments. It is time to move aggressively in this direction. And then in this book, which is called Nutrient Power, Heal Your Biochemistry and Heal Your Brain, this book presents a more natural treatment system based on current science and can help millions of people who have been diagnosed with mental disorders. This approach recognizes that most human beings have nutritional imbalances due to genetic and environmental factors, and these imbalances can cause mischief in many ways, which include the following. And then he mentions about serotonin, dopamine, and other key neurotransmitters, that they can be a problem. And he said that they are normally continuously produced in the brain from nutrient raw materials that may be at improper concentrations. Nutrient imbalances can alter gene expression of proteins that govern neurotransmitter activity at synapses, and deficiency in antioxidant nutrients can cripple the brain's protection against toxic metals. So it's also a very good book to read. The one thing he mentions glial cells in here, and I just can't believe he's not aware of the studies on the glial cells, which is about as high as 80 to 85% of the brain, and everybody talks about neurons. But the glial cells also utilize neurotransmitters, and they also carry on all kinds of functions. There's a tremendous amount of material. I think I mentioned earlier a book called The Other Brain that talks about the fact that we've ignored all these years even looking at the glial cells because we thought they did nothing more than support the neurons, which were the functional cells, and that was caused by two brothers many years ago who started doing neurological research, and the one brother said the neurons are really the functional cells, and so therefore the other brother said, well, the glial are only supportive, so yeah, we should just study the neurons. Okay, so now we have two things: nutritional deficiency, involving especially the minerals, but there's all kinds of things in nutrient-dense food. Vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, proteins also. And all that is there that is available for our body to use if the food has it in it to begin with, and or it's not loaded with some type of toxic material based on genetic modifications. Okay, and the other factor we mentioned is the emotional mental state, because the emotions, and as I say, Bruce Lipton gets into that heavily in his book on the biology of belief, how what's going on in our mind and emotions can affect how the genes express as well as the nutrients. The two work together, and so as I mentioned, the consciousness and healing, or mind-body medicine, is a good introduction to a lot of the thinking that's going on in those directions. The third big thing, of course, is the toxic environment, because we can't get away from it. I mentioned how much mercury, a microgram per day, we just breathe in. Forget what we get in through the food we eat. And we get, I think it's like 4 or 5, 6 micrograms a day of mercury from the food that we ingest. Unless you're a heavy seafood eater, it could be even higher. So we're constantly ingesting that, and if we don't have the right nutrients to take care of that and other toxins to get in our body, then we're in trouble. Now, I'm saying all this because I was thinking that, and I mentioned it with the vaccinations, if we come in contact with viruses and our body is functioning well, it will be at most a minor issue that our body can take care of. But if we don't have it, then we're in trouble, but we're in more trouble than we know, because our immune system is also dependent on all of this. And we don't even have time to go into all those areas. I'm trying to keep this to a shorter video today. so that we don't overwhelm you with too much, but give you enough to get you going. And of course, the next thing, which would be the fourth thing, is the suppression of deficiency symptoms with drugs. In other words, if we're eating food that's not dense enough in nutrients for our body to work right, we develop symptoms. And sometimes they're subclinical, meaning we don't have gross scurvy today, but we can have a subclinical level of deficiency and things not work right in the body. So if we're looking for beriberi and pellagra and scurvy and all these things, we probably, at least in this country, aren't likely to see those. But certainly, on the subclinical level, all those functions in the body that depend on those nutrients aren't working right. And in some cases, they start working not at all. Okay, so, and then if you suppress what symptoms do get expressed in the body, which means if you go back and read those early studies in the early 1920s and 30s on the miracle men, you will see that things like cardiovascular problems, cancer, neurological problems, gastrointestinal problems, behavioral issues, and so forth, diabetes, all of these started becoming more pronounced as the food became poorer and poorer in quality. And so what we get then with the suppressive treatment, going back to homotoxicology, now as I say, bit by bit, you see how all these things all fit together that I've been giving you so that you can understand what's happening in your body. Suppression leads to chronic illnesses, and that's in homotoxicology. And so from the suppression, you then get chronic illness, and from the chronic illness you get organ damage because of either malnutrition or the drugs that are given you to manage the symptoms, especially liver and kidneys really fare bad with a lot of these drugs. And from the damage to the organ, you ultimately get organ failure. And of course, from organ failure, then you get organ transplants. And of course, once you get the transplant, your doom is pretty well sealed, because now they have to wipe out your immune system for you to retain the organ. Hence, your body is dependent on the drug keeping your immune system knocked out. And so something could come along, i.e. a virus or whatever, and wipe you out because your immune system is non-functional. And they don't talk a lot about how long the people live with the transplants. But from my personal knowledge, I've seen that it's not a whole lot of time. I'm not saying that the people shouldn't do it once they get to that point. I'm only saying it still is not an answer. The answer is prevention, to keep it from getting there. And the answer is to keep your immune system strong by having the proper elements and nutrition in your body to support the immune system. Because without it, you're not going to do well. And besides, on top of it, the emotional aspects, which also can shut down the immune system. So there's a lot of things that you can do to address this, but it's difficult. I'm not saying it's not difficult in today's world, because every place you look, everything is amiss. We have allowed large corporations to manipulate us and sell us sometimes pure garbage to put in our bodies under the guise that we are it's going to taste good to us, because they lace it with enhancers, monosodium glutamate, a lot of them, to make it have a little bit more flavor, a lot of sugar, a lot of bad oils, and of course a lot of pollution. And then on top of that, no nutrients. You got a losing combination, in fact a very seriously detrimental combination. Now, one other thing I'm going to throw in, because I think it's something that ties along with this, because there's something else that can be deficient, and we're probably not getting much of it, as some of the research is showing, is that there's an interesting book called Sugars That Heal. Now, right away, everybody's going to say, well, wait a minute, is sugar bad? Well, it depends on the sugar. But within the body, there are types of sugars that are called glyconutrients that carry on functions and also can be part of the structure that are extremely important for our body to function well. They affect the immune system, they affect, as I say, all the various biochemic steps and so forth. And up to this point, there's been 8 major ones that have been isolated. And you've probably heard maybe of some of them if you've done anything in the health field at all, like xylitol, which is a trade name of xylose, which is one of those. D-ribose is one. Trehalose is another. Arabinogalactin. There's a group of key ones that there's been a lot of studies on. And if those are missing, big problems develop. Diabetes is one of the problems that has been demonstrated can happen if you don't have the glyconutrients. Now, fortunately and unfortunately, we get back to supplementation. My feeling is supplementation is a stopgap, and sometimes extra support to get you back on the road to health, but without eating the healthy food and without managing the stress and without getting away from the drugs and manipulative chemicals that we're given to make us feel better, then you can be deficient in these, and therefore they're recommending, the sources that could supply those. Now, it can be done with our diet also, and they are very important factors. It's been ignored, but now there's a big move in research to talk more about them, and I've just found out recently that they've isolated now as high as 23 different ones, but the 8 that are talked about heavily in this book are the 8 big ones that have been isolated and highly studied as to what they do in the body, and hence the need of them being there. And the other subtitle of this book is The New Healing Science of Glyconutrients. Glyco meaning glucose or sugar, and glucose happens to be one of those, but glucose is not the same as sucrose and some of the other things that we're being fed. Hence, it doesn't do the same thing, but glucose carries on functions in the body and is very important for body function, but in sucrose you have also fructose, and fructose creates issues in the body, and hence there's a big problem. Now, these have one called fucose, but it's not fructose, and so some people when they first see it think, oh, that's crazy because that's not good, but it's not fructose, it's fucose. And also, some of these work on immune enhancement, some various cell functions, cell wall, and so forth. And as I said, diabetes is a big factor that they've studied a lot, but also immune function is a big factor they've studied a lot. So I guess we're stuck in some respects having to utilize some of these to turn people around, but at the same time, we need to get nutrients in to keep people well, and that involves eating pure, nutrient-dense food and not GMO things. Now, there's a lot of it out there, and as I say, they don't have to market in this country, but you are going to see products that says no GMO products. That means that they have tested it and that what they're using does not have genetically modified organisms. Which is, I don't know why well, I guess that meant any kind of, because you could genetically organize bacteria and worms and so forth, but so they call it genetically modified organisms. But it's very important, and there's a lot more coming out about it, and if you don't believe me, just get on the internet and do it, Google, and see what you end up with. There's a lot of material there, and you can actually find current lists of known GMO food that's out on the market, and it's much broader than what you think, even than what was in the book I mentioned, Seeds of Deception. There's a lot more now even than when he was talking about it here, and it's now spread around, although there's some countries now that are looking at it in a negative way. the pressure is on to get everybody to have seed that's been genetically modified and patented, and hence no one can grow, because it also won't produce seed that can grow more of a product. So therefore, you are kind of stuck. Every year you have to buy it from the company that modified it, or you don't have it. And the other part of the whole plan was to destroy all the natural seeds, so you couldn't do anything on your own. And there were even some suggested laws being passed by the big giant who's behind all this. There was some suggestion that laws be passed that it's illegal to grow non-GMO foods. In other words, organically growing things that are not genetically modified could put you in jail. So that's how big the issue is, and if you're not aware of it up to this point, you definitely do want to become aware. So that's the other thing you can do along with the homeopathic medicine, and whether you're doing any kind of therapy, if your body has the proper nutrition then, and is more free of toxins, number one, you're less inclined to be sick, but if you were to get sick, you're much easier to get well if these other conditions are met. So I hope I'm kind of giving you a good general picture. I don't want to drive it into the ground, but I want to open your eyes to some of the things. How important it is that even from the genetic standpoint, it's important that you get good, high-density, nutrient food in your body. Okay, so I guess that's it until our next video. I'm always looking for subjects, so if you have some subject you don't think I've covered, you can be happy to email it's ddmayfield at mindyourhealthcast.com, and or you can join the forum on the website mindyourhealthcast.com. But as I have time to do the research, I work on not presenting something that I haven't done a pretty thorough review of what's out in the world and what's available and what's being done, so that I can give you as accurate information as possible. I can't say that I never missed something. I could. Many things that I'm aware of you'll probably never hear about. But I work very hard at getting the best information and getting you sources where you can find that information. So if you get any of these books that I mentioned, they're going to give you a lot more information, a lot more resources. And someday, I guess, I'm just going to make a list and talk about some of the key resources that you need, websites and materials that are available. And so much of it is either free, except for buying books, and in some cases, if the books are out of print, you can download the book. So until next time, we look forward to seeing you, and in the meantime, be healthy.